Welcome back. Hope you've had a good Halloween so far. Trick-or-treating's later. No? No. Your midterms, you should all pick up your midterms. That's like trick-or-treat when you go up there, see what's going to happen. You should get them. If you haven't gotten them, I'll be available after class today. The meetings start with me today, and I want to go over the exam a little bit first. So the long and short of it, as you read my email, is I was a bit disappointed. There were a lot of mistakes that shouldn't have been made. And there are a lot of things I told you not to do that you did. And there are a lot of things I told you to do that you didn't do. So maybe that's a failure for me or a failure elsewhere, but I take it seriously nonetheless. The distribution was pretty poor. The mean was a 285, which is about as low as I can give under the school's curve. There were no failures, which is good, so all of you are starting off on a blank slate for the final. But there were some close failures, people who came close. My stand for failing a paper is, have this person learned anything this semester? Have they show me nothing? And if you show me nothing, I will fail you. You'll pass that hurdle. It's not a very high hurdle to meet, but there's some pretty poor grades. So let me walk through a couple of the high-level points. One, you have to know what time period you're in. I have mentioned this several times. On the final, there'll be one question in the present day and a second question on some time in the past. I sometimes flip it, 1, 2, 2, 1. We will have one question on the present day, one question on the past. The reason why I do that is I want you to understand how doctrine worked at a specific point in time. So this question came up in 1862. If you're citing Youngstown, you're wrong. If you're citing Wickard, you're wrong. If you're citing Lopez, you're wrong. A lot of you did that. Inexplicable. Don't do it again. Right? Make that mistake here, not on your final exam. This is why having commercial outlines, whatever you want to bring, just won't help you. Because it'll give you stuff that's not relevant to your time period. Okay? Second, I suspect time is a problem for a lot of you. No one burned the word limit, which is actually good. In my property class, a few students went above the word limit, which is problematic. But a lot of you wrote very little, which tells me either you didn't have enough time or you didn't have enough to say, both of which are problematic. I can help you on time much more than I can help you with substance, because the timing, there are techniques you can use. But the question itself this semester was very short. It was like a page and a half. But it's deceptively short, because there's a lot of stuff packed into it. So here's what I suggest, and please write this down, because I think it'll help all of you. You have 90 minutes per question, right? 90 minutes. I would give yourself 30 minutes to read the question. Very, very carefully. 30 minutes to read the question. You start off by reading the little instruction box, then read the 5 prompts at the end, and then go back and actually read the fact pattern. That should take you 30 minutes. If you start writing before minute 20, you're doing it wrong, because you're going to be scrambling, you have to go back and read it, you don't know what to do. So give yourself 20, I'd say 30, but 20, 30 minutes. Given 30 minutes to read, you have an hour left over. You have an hour for 12 questions. I'm sorry, you have an hour for 5 questions. That means 12 minutes apiece. I did the division backwards, right? You have an hour for 5 questions. That means about 12 minutes per piece. Do not spend 20 minutes in question number 1, because that means you'll have no time left for question number 5. I know what it's like when you have a really good, strong number 1, and then by the time you get to number 5, it's like really bad. I know what that means, right? In fact, if you look at my grading book, the average for question number 1 is much higher than the average for question number 5. It happens every year without fail, which means you're rushing the 5th question, right? They're all worth the same number of points. So give yourself a fixed time for each exam. Bring a watch. Don't rely on the clock that's behind you or here or whatever it may be. Bring a real watch, not an Apple Watch, please. A real watch, a normal watch that you can't cheat on. And time yourself and say, I will read the exam from 6 till 6:30. And from 6:30 to 6:32, I'm sorry, 6:30 to 6:42, I'll read question number 1. And 6:42 to 6:54, I'll read question number 2. And actually stop yourself at that mark. Like legit, stop writing, move to the next one. It's much better to get a 7 on question number 1 and a 7 on question number 2 than a 9 on question number 1 and a 5 on question number 2, right? you're gonna, actually 4 or 3, right? You bank more points, actually they're the same example. But if you do really well in question number 1 and then pretty poorly in question number 2, you're not helping yourself. So just bank as many points as you can. I'll work with you if timing's a problem. And the way you can do this is by taking the old exams in your time conditions. You can practice this, you'll get better at it, I promise. But I can just tell from the word limits that a lot of you just either ran out of time or didn't have enough to say. And those are problems that you can help yourself with. The third one is a problem that's not specific to you. It's all human beings. You don't read the damn question. It blows my mind when I read really good analysis for a question I didn't ask, and it breaks my heart. It's like, wow, this person knows their stuff, but they're answering a question I didn't ask. I can't give you full credit. So read the questions very carefully. Look at what I'm asking. Don't just assume because I use the word commerce I'm talking about something else. Read the question. I framed them very deliberately. And there's a second point that's related. Each of the 5 questions is addressing a different topic. Okay? If you find yourself writing that the answer for question number 1 is the same as question number 2, you probably misread the question. I don't have overlap. Occasionally I'll get a paper that says, please see my answer for number 1. I'm not going to do that because that's wrong. Each question is addressing a different topic. I make them very deliberate. Now, they're on the same fact pattern, but you should not be repeating yourself. If you find yourself repeating yourself, go back and revisit the question and see, what did I do wrong? Okay? So those are 3 overarching strategies that will help you in general. That make sure you know your time period, get yourself correct with your time limits, and answer the damn question. If you just do those things, you're on track for a B. I mean that sincerely. It's not that hard. The threshold's not that high, right? If you want to get above a B, you have to do a lot more. But if you just do those 3 things, you're on track for a B. Okay? I trust me on that one when I say that. Now I want to go over the actual question itself. And I put these things in an email so you can read it at your leisure. But I want to high-level points. So this was a fairly, I think a fairly specific fact pattern. And it involved, effectively, the Emancipation Proclamation, not issued by executive order, but issued by the Congress in the form of statute, right? Basically, I took Lincoln's executive order and made it a statute. That was the basis of the exam. But it also had some jurisdictional questions. Think, Josh, this isn't SIMFRA. Well, we discussed this a lot in Dred Scott, 11th Amendment. So I wanted to find a way to test you on these items. So the first one was a diversity case involving Frederick, who was described as a slave from Georgia, and Ashley Wilkes, if you can get the reference, from Gone with the Wind, who was from Georgia, then moved to Virginia. So the first question was Scott a citizen? And under Dred Scott, the answer is no, but that wasn't the only way to resolve the question. And specifically, we discussed this in class. How should courts construe Dred Scott, right? Or is everyone bound by it? Is it just bound by the 2 parties? Did Congress disagree with Dred Scott? These are themes we talked about in class that a lot of you brought in, which I was very happy about. The second part was one that a lot of you just simply missed, and I was surprised. Was Ashley a citizen of the United States? Right? This was the wrinkle, right? It was possible that Frederick was a citizen, perhaps, but the guy who moved to the Confederacy was not. Was it a foreign country? Or was Virginia part of the United States? Right? That was the wrinkle I wanted you to hit. Were the states in the South part of the United States in rebellion, or did they actually secede? And that's a legal question we discussed, right? What is the status of Virginia? I think ultimately it wouldn't matter whether you're a citizen of Virginia or a foreign country, you still have diversity of jurisdiction. That's not the question. But I wanted, a couple of you got there, which I was happy about, to actually discuss the status of these states. So it wasn't just Frederick, it was also Ashley, and almost all of you focused exclusively on Frederick and not the other party. It takes 2 to tango for diversity jurisdiction. Okay? So that was question number 1. Question number 2 considered the constitutionality of the Federal Emancipation Act. There was a state one and also a federal one. So this was actually a question with a lot of different twists, and you didn't have to hit all these to get an A. In fact, no one hit all these, which is why I don't really give a model answer because it's not fair. But let me just go through them. First, this statute's basically ignoring Dred Scott. Let's just be candid about this, right? Dred Scott said that people of African descent could never be citizens, period. And this statute is doing precisely that. So we should discuss that. The second angle is Commerce Clause. You don't have Wicker. I actually tricked you. I did this deliberately. I put the word substantial effects in the statute, right? I did that deliberately to try and trick you, and it worked for most people. That was not a phrase in case law. The cases you had were Gibbons v. Ogden, right? From John Marshall some years earlier. So could Congress regulate slavery as an economic activity under 1860s case law? I think the answer is probably no, but I go either way on that. A lot of you cited Prigg, which I thought was pretty good. That was a fugitive slave case. So that's another case. Necessary and proper. You could have cited McCulloch v. Maryland. I think that was another angle. Also, the president's wartime powers. We discussed this, right? Could Lincoln or Congress seize this property as an exercise of war powers? You should be discussing the Takings Clause. Although the Takings Clause does not apply to Congress, does not apply to the states under Barron, it would apply to the federal government. And we discussed this, whether compensation would have to be provided. So there are a lot of different angles to assess the constitutionality of the federal act. If you hit a couple of those, I basically gave you full credit. But you have to hit several of them, not just commerce. There's a lot of things that you have to bring to bear when you answer these questions that aren't always going to be in the question. By the way, let me stop. Any questions on number 1 and 2? I forgot this pause. I'm sorry. Questions on 1 or 2? Okay, I'll do number 3. I'm sorry, I forgot to pause. You do. The third one involved the State Emancipation Act. And there was a lawsuit filed by a citizen of Maryland against the state of Maryland. Okay, so what cases we have? We have Chisholm, right? Chisholm against Georgia. That involves suing another state, right? So I'm a resident of Texas, I sue Louisiana. The 11th Amendment, at least on the text, only addressed that situation where you have a citizen suing another state. This, though, is going to be like Hans v. Louisiana, where a citizen sues his own state. But we don't have Hans yet. It was not decided for another 30 or 40 years. So what the good papers did was discuss whether or not the various opinions in Chisholm give us an answer, right? Justice Iredell, Justice Wilson, right? Is there this concept of sovereign immunity, where even if the 11th Amendment was never ratified, you still cannot sue your own state? That is what I was looking for. A lot of you said, oh, you're under Hans, whatever. It hadn't been decided yet. I want you to actually work through the analysis in Hans, right, based on what you knew from Chisholm. Right? That's what this question was asking you about. A state can't be sued without consent? Fine. Show me why in Chisholm. Okay? Any questions? Number 3. Yes, sir.
Technically, I mentioned that it wouldn't, be decided until Hans. Does that get
I appreciate the effort. I think it's a good idea, but to get the major points, you'd have to discuss Chisholm and the various opinions there. I mean, it's nice. That's what you did is better than what some other students did and said, under Hans, here's the answer, right? That, treating Hans as binding precedent is ignoring the question. What you did is basically tiptoeing around the question, right? Yeah. But there's, I mean, I'm not going to take points off for it, but just you're not going to get points added. That's the way I look at it, right? So any other questions on number 3? Yes, Sir Jackson?
How much of the other opinions besides the majority opinions do we need to know, for each case? Is it just the...
Was there a majority opinion in Chisholm?
Well, no, there's the 5.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I mean, as far as other cases go...
If we discuss concurring dissenting opinions, you have to know it. They're all... This is why property is different than other classes. You need to know all the opinions. They're all important. Very often the dissent might be more important than the concurring opinion for the majority. You got to know them all. We're doing today Griswold, Roe, you got to know them all. Lochner, you got the majority dissents. You have to know. Any other questions? Number 3. Yes.
I have a question about what you just said. I've seen some of the cases where they were overturned later on by the dissent reporter, but I don't see why, other than that was just sort of the alternate argument why dissents were so important.
Oh, but you just said it. I'm not interested in what 5 people think is a correct law at any given time. That's irrelevant for me. I want to know all the various arguments on both sides. That's far more important. Understand? Right? In other words, And if you read the introduction of your casebook, it says, for those who believe the Constitution is more than what the Supreme Court says. I don't pretend that the Constitution is whatever 5 justices say at any given moment. There might be cases where the dissent's correct, and you have to know it. Maybe they're wrong, but you have to at least be able to decide why they're right or wrong yourself. Okay?
So for that question, bringing up Iredell and Chisholm.
Good. Right. Exactly. And if you look at the A+ paper, there's an Iredell, Wilson, right? It talks about the various judges from the Chisholm opinion. We spent some time in that case. I deliberately spent time on it, and I'll explain there are different opinions. There's no majority. You got to tease it out. Okay. Okay. Number 4. Number 4 concerned the constitutionality of the state act. So we know that under the state police power, the state has a lot of authority to protect the safety and welfare of the people. You don't have to worry about Commerce Clause here. You don't have to worry about the Necessary and Proper Clause here. I can't tell you how many students are writing about the Necessary and Proper Clause for number 4, was at the state police power. It broke my heart. When you deal with the state police power, there is no federalism, right? It's not separation of powers. You don't have to worry about that. What you have to worry about is the takings clause, right? If indeed this affects the taking of property and you're required under the Fifth Amendment to provide compensation, the statute's void. But is Maryland bound by the takings clause? No. Under Barron v. Baltimore, right? And I even use Maryland as the state, right? That's the state we're talking about. The state of Maryland was allowed to take property and was under no obligation to provide compensation. So Barron provided the rule of decision. A lot of you just said, yeah, they're bound by the Fifth Amendment. Some of you actually wrote they're bound by the 14th Amendment. Hadn't been ratified yet, right? 14th Amendment had not been ratified yet, 1868, a couple of years off. So that was an application of Barron. Okay? That was actually one of the easier questions, I think. Fewest wrinkles. So any questions number 4? No? Okay, let's go on number 5. The last one, number 5, is always my policy question. Always policy. And I have basically an unlimited number of these. In property, I tell my students there's only so many I can ask. Here, there are a lot I can ask. And the setup was this. If indeed the court ordered for the release of the slave in Maryland, there will be no enforcement. Why? The militia of Maryland was under a stress from the Civil War, and they didn't have time to enforce civil judgments. Right? This is the question we ask in class. What happens if the court orders to desegregate a school and federal troops don't show up to escort the kids into the building? Right? What happens? That's exactly what I'm asking you about here. And there was a wide range of things you could have written about here. Under Marbury versus Madison, right? If Jefferson had ignored Marshall, what would have happened? In Hamilton, Federalist number 78, the courts have neither the power of the sword nor the power of the purse, right? The least dangerous branch. Ex parte merriment, right? I mean, that's more or less what this was based off of. When Tawney sent his marshal to the court to go arrest the general, knock, knock, knock on the door, right? He's like, go away. What do you do when courts are going to ignore them? Okay, so I wasn't asking for like a long essay, but if you just hit some of these points, you got most of the credit. Answers here were all over the place. In some places, you basically copied what you wrote for a number of 2 or 3 here. And again, if you're repeating yourself, just a rule of thumb, if you're repeating yourself, you've probably done something wrong. So I don't ask the same question multiple times. A lot of you either maybe had nothing new to say, or you panicked, you started writing this, talking about the Commerce Clause, Justice Jackson in Youngstown, steel mills, that wasn't going to cut it. So, again, the exams weren't awful. I think the 3 things I mentioned at the outset about being aware of what time you're in, not rushing at the end, and keeping track of what the question is. If you can just do those things, you'll bring the class average up above a 3. I have no doubt in my mind. So that can be done. Beyond that, it's up to you to get yourself to an A. But you can at least get a class average up a little bit closer to a B, 3.0, just by doing those few things. But I look forward to, I mean this sincerely, to meet with every one of you. I don't ever see students outside of class. You never come to office hours. So unless I conscript you and force you to come on a 30-minute block, it's there. But, so I'll warn you a few things of how these meetings will go down. Some of you may be seeing me in a couple hours. First of all, make sure you bring your papers, and I want you to compare yourself to the A+. Now, the A+ is not perfect. I think the A+ got 43 out of 50, which means the A+ lost 7 points, right? Not perfect, not even close. I've never given a perfect 100. I think I got like a 96 or 97. I've never had a perfect 100 on an exam. Hasn't happened yet. So take it with a grain of salt, and it's possible you wrote something that's correct and the other person didn't. But I want you to understand where you did well and where you missed and where you didn't. The second thing I'm going to be focusing on during these meetings is your notes. Now, I'm not here to review your outline. I have no insights into what works best for you. But I'm going to ask you something on your exam that maybe you didn't get right. And if you tell me I don't know the answer, I'll say, okay, go find it in your notes. And I'll wait there until you find it. And eventually what happens is after 5 minutes, so the student finds it in their notes. It's like, oh, it's right over here. I'm like, okay, good. So you had it, right? You actually learned what was on the exam. You just didn't recall it. And the reason why I put you through this exercise, which may seem painful, it probably is to make you realize that you're actually doing a good job preparing in class and preparing at home. It's the disconnect when you get to cramming, when you get to study time, right? I've had to bring out the outline. I mean, I do this, again, I know it's painful. There's, oh, black, leave me alone. It's for your benefit. I want you to see, you probably have all good outlines. I'm pretty sure at this point you're well enough in law school. But you need to be able to pull it out and know what's in there. And I promise you, after you do that exercise, you'll say, okay, here's how I'm going to structure my notes differently. Good, do that. I'll also ask you, how'd you study? Right, what was your preparation? I budget these for 30 minutes deliberately, because I want to make sure I have time to get time to talk to you one-on-one. If you do what I hope you all do, the class average will go up, I have no doubt. It's impossible to give everyone A, it's just the school won't let me, right? The way these distributions work is I have fairly fixed curves. Where is it? I have a fairly fixed curve. You know, no more than, was it 30% of you can get an A minus or higher. I'm bound. But if you do well, I can make the class average go up to 3. I've done it before. I've had the class average at 3.1. So you see, more than half of you get a B. I can do it. But you have to push yourself there. I can't do it with these sorts of papers. Okay? So with that long wind-up, any other questions? Anything in your minds? Yes, Emily?
To save on the word count, Heather had said to abbreviate things in our...
That's fine.
Is that okay?
You'll save a couple words here and there. It's not going to make or break you.
It might add up.
It's worse, like, if you want to use an acronym like SDP instead of substantive due process, I probably know what you mean. I've seen a lot of abbreviations in my years teaching here. Once in a while, I get an abbreviation that's like 6 or 7 letters long. I don't know what it is. And so you take a risk. It's like, wow, he doesn't know what it is. So then I get people emailing me in advance saying, what about this abbreviation? And I roll my eyes. But you can try to use abbreviations. It's not going to help you that much. You might save 2 or 3 words out of 1,000. I don't know. But thank you for the question. Yes, Kelsey?
Before the finals, can you go over like how you do the word count on the new? We have a new exam.
Yeah, go ask the registrar. The problem is they don't give me a copy of the software. Like, I've tried this before. So once what I had to end up doing was like taking one of my students' laptops and like putting it under the camera. It's like they don't. It's a weird thing. They don't give me access to it. But if you go to the registrar, they'll teach you what to do. And they change it every semester, it seems. So it's always somewhere else. But unfortunately, no one in this class burned the word limit, so that wasn't a problem, at least in the midterm. Any other questions? Questions.
What is that, your edges and averages? What does that all mean?
This is the school's official curve. And you probably don't see this, but this is the spreadsheet we use. In order to make sure our grades are consistent from one class to the next, we have to make our grades fit in here. So what this means is, I can't give more than 16% of the class an A. Okay? But I can't give less than 9% of the class an A. So between 9 and 16% of you have to get an A. For A minus, it's a little bit bigger, between 16 and 30. So basically, a third of the class can get an A minus or higher. But I can't give less than 16% of the class that. I more or less have as many B's as I want. There's not much constraint there. But you have the same constraints below. For C and lower, only between 9 and 16%, right? And for C plus and lower, between 16 and 30. The third constraint is the class average. That's between a 285 and 315. So that's my range. So you guys were at 285, was basically right at the bottom. My property, I think, was about 2.9 for the midterm. My final, depending how class does, around 3.1, 3.05. I can get you up there. I don't think about these things when I'm grading, but inevitably they coalesce naturally. I don't ever. You all curve naturally. I don't have to do much work. Students more or less fall along a curve in a class of 50 or 60 people. It happens naturally. I don't have to think about it, but I can tweak at the edges how many B's or C's. There's a little bit of give. And the way it works is if there are more B's or C's, you get higher or lower on the mean. Other questions? Other questions? No? All right, well, I look forward to meeting each of you at the exam reviews, and now we can actually turn to today's lecture. Let's start with this question. Only two cases for today with Griswold and Rowe, but are significant cases. Okay, I have to turn this thing off. Okay, all right, so this is your question. Justice Douglas's opinion in Griswold v. Connecticut was consistent with footnote 4 of Caroline Products. Justice Douglas's opinion in Griswold v. Connecticut is consistent with footnote 4 of Caroline Products. Okay, let's start around. Who right? Who is next? Who's next? Someone must be next. Don't make me call someone.
I went last.
You want last, Jackson? You next?
No, I wasn't here last class, but I'll do it.
We were there, because I went twice last month.
Eric? Oh,
I don't know, I wasn't here last.
that's why I'm starting with you. In fact, we had a question about the Virginia case, which was a military academy. You were in a military academy?
I've heard that.
Yeah, so
I dodged a bullet.
Yeah, you got it. It's boomerang.
I'm happy with this one rather than kind of answering.
All right, sir. What'd you give us for this one?
I said true.
Okay. Why do you think it's true?
The 4 footnotes in the Caroline case, or footnote 4 in the Caroline case, was the ones that restricted. I'm actually honestly not remembering. I guess I'm blanking on the footnotes.
Okay. I think Jessica, you're next. I'm sorry. No?
Usually goes this way.
Oh, I do my other class anyway. Okay. Mark, redeem Eric. What's the answer here?
So, I said false.
Okay.
And I don't know how well I'm going to be able to redeem them, but. So footnote 4 was about we apply strict scrutiny when a law goes against one of the parts of the Bill of Rights, right?
That's part of it. Good.
I didn't think about it in terms of footnote 4 before now.
That's why I'm doing it. Laura, you want to take a stab?
Okay, so I know footnote 4 says that strict scrutiny is rights, political process with minorities. And in this case, it was about the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. So I think it's false because it was interpreted broadly, so strict scrutiny wasn't applied here.
Okay, so let's walk through footnote 4. And we talked about this a few weeks ago, but it's a good time to review. Always a good time to review. And you recall the Caroline Products case had to do with filled milk, and whether Congress could prohibit filled milk, dense milk, from being shipped in interstate commerce. So it was ostensibly a Commerce Clause case, but it involved due process as well. And in this long footnote, it had nothing to do with the case. Chief Justice Stone, writing for 4 justices, the dictamizers, if you will, put forward this test. And he wrote, and I'll read it to you, there may be a narrower scope for the operation of the presumption of constitutionality when legislation appears on its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those of the first 10 amendments, which are deemed equally specific when held to be embraced within the 14th Amendment. All right? So actually, what is that paragraph saying, just in your own words? What's that first paragraph saying? And then you're on deck for the second paragraph to give your preview. What's that saying, Ashley? Jarbled, right? It's jumbled together, right? Hard to read. What's it getting at?
So, when legislation occurs.
Let's take it one clause at a time. What does it mean to have a narrow scope for the presumption of constitutionality? What does that mean, just right there?
That it's.
Well, let's make it simple. What's the presumption of constitutionality? Just by
That it
itself.
follows the Constitution. That it's.
When a court is applying the presumption of constitutionality, what is it doing?
That the constitutionality, or the Constitution, it's presumed by the Constitution that it's to be one way or the other.
No, Emily. What's presumption of constitutionality mean?
That the law is constitutional, like this.
What does the word presumption mean?
Presume is to, like, implying kind of.
Who's doing the presuming there?
The Supreme Court.
The courts, right. So this notion of the presumption of constitutionality is that when a law makes it through the democratic process, courts are going to presume, if you will, that it is constitutional. And you all know what happens when you assume, right? You want another bit?
Yeah.
You ever know where it's from? The odd couple. Make an ass out of you and me, assume. So the court presumes that, generally speaking, laws are constitutional. But this presumption can be narrowed, right? The presumption can be narrowed in different circumstances. In other words, you're rebutting this presumption of constitutionality in certain circumstances. So Ashley, back to you, let's finish this up. When legislation appears to be on its face within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as the first 10 amendments, right? What does that mean there?
So when legislation is specifically opposite to what the Constitution, or does not go.
Give me an example.
Like segregation, or separate but not equal.
I'll tell you, back in the 1930s, was Plessy still good law?
Well, I mean for today. I guess.
In the 1930s, it absolutely was. But you're on the right track. I'll give maybe a different example, right? Let's say a statute says we're going to shut down this newspaper, right? Do we afford such a law the presumption of constitutionality?
I mean, like freedom of speech. Is that what do you?
The statute says all newspapers must shut down in this city. No newspapers
there's
allowed.
not a specific.
Oh,
No.
freedom of the press, though. Right? So, Shivan, right? If you have a statute that says all newspapers in this town must shut down, how does that fit into this first paragraph?
Well, if it goes against the freedom of the press,
right?
then it would not be constitutional. Or,
Use the words. Use the words here.
it would not be presumed as
Yeah,
constitutional.
good, right? It does not get the benefit of the doubt, right? When you have some law that looks on its face to be going against a specific provision of the Constitution, in such cases, it does not get afforded the presumption of constitutionality. You narrow the scope, right? That's what it means. You're narrowing the scope of the law because it goes against the Bill of Rights. So to state this really easy, right? If something violates the Constitution, you don't give it rational basis review. You can say it real simple, right? When it's violating the Constitution, you give it a little more oomph, a little more scrutiny. Call it strict scrutiny, whatever you will, but you look at it a little more closely. Okay, that's first paragraph of footnote 4. There are three components. We did this before, but I want to review it today. Okay, Brittany, so what about the second paragraph, right? It says, it is unnecessary to consider now whether legislation which restricts those political processes which would ordinarily be expected to bring about repeal of the undesirable legislation is to be subjected to more exacting judicial scrutiny under the 14th Amendment. Okay, so what's going on there, Brittany?
Is it saying that they don't even have to go through the process of going through the state legislation and letting them repeal it if they know that it's unconstitutional under those provisions, that they can exact judicial scrutiny, throw it out under the 14th Amendment? Is that what they're saying?
Well, let me ask this question differently, Brittany. I think you're on the right track. So first off, they're not deciding and saying, we don't need to decide this, it's unnecessary. But there's this other issue, right? What happens if legislation restricts the political processes that would ordinarily be allowed to use to repeal undesirable legislation? So, Brittany, with presumption of constitutionality, right, what do you generally say to someone who doesn't like the law? Right? They say, this law is unfair. The court says, I'm sorry, we give this presumption of unconstitutionality. If we don't like it, do X. What's X?
Go do it at the state level.
Repeal it.
You repeal it, yeah.
Exactly, right? So generally with the presumption of constitutionality, if there's a law that you don't like, the court's going to say, look, this is not for us to deal with. Go to your legislature, go elect some people, go repeal the law, right? Repeal this undesirable legislation. But
if it's so unconstitutional, they can jump over that and
no.
no.
Jay, what's this paragraph getting at? Why is it not the case that the legislation can be repealed in the normal process? What are they getting at right here? Why can't, generally, undesirable legislation can be repealed? Is that right? Why is certain types of undesirable legislation not going to be repealed? What's they getting at in this paragraph?
Because of it can't be repealed because of the general prohibitions of the 14th Amendment.
No. What about the law at issue makes it unlikely to be repealed? Right?
Because it's already being subjected to more scrutiny.
No. John?
It's harder to repeal because the method in which you would repeal it is being restricted by the new law.
How?
So if it's restricting your ability to vote.
Yes. That's the point. If the law itself restricts access to the political process, right? The law itself makes it harder to vote, then you can't put people in office to repeal it. Right? If we're dealing with a normal law, let's say that regulates the weight of bread, we've done cases like this, or the conditions in bakeries, right? Nothing in that law makes it harder for you to vote to change that regime. But let's say there's a poll tax imposed. Oh. And let's say there's a literacy test imposed that restricts the franchise. And let's say there's a grandfathering test which says you can't vote unless your grandfather voted. Right? How are you going to repeal that law if you can't vote for people who want to repeal it? Everyone see with it, right? How can you repeal a law where you yourself lack the power to vote people into office? And it says it right there. Restrictions on the right to vote, on dissemination of information, interference with political organizations, prohibition of peaceful assembly, right? What if, you know, a state passes a law that makes all nonprofit groups disclose their membership list? That happens to the NAACP in Alabama, right? And then all the people on that list are getting killed off. You think you can go to a meeting? Probably not. So these certain types of laws that make it hard to affect political change, those too are subject to more exacting scrutiny of the 14th Amendment, right? You scrutinize such laws more closely precisely because they impact the political process. Yeah, this is different from number one, right? The first paragraph. That was about provisions in the Bill of Rights. Paragraph two concerns laws that impact the political process. Everyone with me so far, right? I'm sorry, did I see a hand somewhere? Okay, everyone with me for paragraph number 2. Right, so paragraph, yeah, Jackson.
So are these all just how they view the laws? They just restrict the presumption before they even view it?
What this footnote's trying to do, and again, it only has 4 votes, it's not actually a law, so it might as well be. What this footnote's trying to do is establish when are courts supposed to give more exacting review. The general review is constitutional. The general norm is a presumption of constitutionality. When do we narrow that? When do we impose more exacting scrutiny, right? What this case was doing is saying, look, we're not going to do Lochner anymore, right? We're not doing Lochner anymore. But we'll use Lochner-style review in a couple specific circumstances. It was trying to think of, like, you know, the Titanic, right? The cabins underneath water that, like, contain it, right? If you fit within one of these 3 containers, we'll give you Lochner. But otherwise, you're outside, right? That's what this case is trying to do, to narrow the scope of Lochner-style substantive due process review. Because the court's saying, we're not going to do this for economic legislation, right? Why? They say economic legislation is not protected by the Constitution. It's this general, vague, due process, you know, liberty thing, right? But if it's in the Constitution, if it's in the Bill of Rights, it's named there. If it involves political process, voting, right? We get there. Yeah, Adam.
Was this discussion we had about courts shouldn't interfere with laws unless they somehow affect the political process? Political process should, you know.
That's exactly what we're talking about. Precisely. Very good. So Rachel, let's do the third. Mark, you flicking your hand? I can't tell.
That's Holmes' dissent in Lochner.
It is. Well, actually, Holmes would just reject footnote 4 entirely. He would say you never reverse the presumption of constitutionality. Right? His Lochner dissent is you never reverse it. Right? Maybe in the Bill of Rights, he eventually came around to free speech later in his career. But Holmes would say we just don't reverse it. Harlan, I think, maybe fits into a little bit better. Right? Holmes upheld many laws that disenfranchise people. He didn't have a problem with that. He upheld laws that, you know, basically grandfathering clause. He upheld that. That's any difficulty. Rachel, let's go to the third paragraph. Let me scroll down a second. Okay. Okay. Nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at a particular religious, citing Pierce v. Society of Sisters, or national, cites Meyer v. Nebraska, or racial minorities, whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition which tends seriously to curtail the operation of those political processes ordinarily to be relied upon to protect minorities, and which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. All right, Rachel, what's going on there in the last paragraph?
So this is what we've been talking about for like the past 2 classes when we're talking about the levels of strict scrutiny, and this is specifically with minorities, or I guess racial. They even mentioned religious, because racial minorities might not have the numbers to seek redress in our political process. So if there is a law that on its face is directed at particular religions or racial minorities, then we should apply a higher judicial scrutiny.
Why? Why is higher scrutiny appropriate in these cases?
Well, I don't know. I think it's similar to what I had said before, is because they, like the process is kind of bent against them.
So is this just a repetition of number 2 for the second paragraph? Does this add anything new? In other words, if the law itself distorts the political process, why do you need this third paragraph? What's added here?
You know, it's particular people.
What about the law is problematic here? What aspect of the law? What were the words used here?
Prejudice against.
Yeah, that's it. Right. So what this third paragraph adds is not just about distortion of political processes, but it's motivated by prejudice. Right? And this goes to maybe like a quo type test or something else that we've studied, where if the law itself has some sort of animus behind it or bias, it's warranted to have heightened judicial review. So this theory, this footnote 4, again, which only had 4 votes, was never actually law, the dictamizers love it, became the most popular theory of constitutional law for better part of the 20th century. It was very popular. And what it allowed courts to do is to say, look, we're not going to be Lochner, we're not going to be second-guessing the wisdom of legislation unless it falls in one of these 3 buckets. If it falls in one of these 3 buckets, then we go full whole hog, go strict scrutiny, and we review the hell out of it, right? This was how courts justified their incursion into the democratic process, right? But as a practical matter, and I want to go back to, I'm going to talk only about the first paragraph for the rest of class. I'm not going to talk much about the second and third. It says, there may be a narrow scope or operation, blah, 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 when legislation appears in its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those of the first 10 amendments. A specific prohibition of the Constitution, right? So if you look at that, it's like, well, that gives us reversing of Lochner. Why? This right of economic liberty is not on the face of any amendment, right? Perhaps you can say this idea of liberty includes economic freedom. You can make that argument. But it's not on its face. But the government tries to shut down a newspaper, that's right in the face of the 14th Amendment, right? Right in the face of the free press clause. So in a case of all these cases involving economic liberty, they say, nope, we're not making up rights. We're not going to read the word liberty to include contract, right? But then we get to the 60s. And then we get to Griswold. And then we get to Justice Douglas's opinion. And the question I asked here at the outset, is Douglas's opinion consistent with footnote 4 of Caroline Products? Right? That was the question I asked. It took me 45 minutes to get there, but it's good. Good review. So Jessica, now I think you are graciously up. What was your answer here at the outset?
Well, I guess, but.
You get. Well, give me your answer now after edification.
I would say that it wasn't on its face.
Oh. What do you mean it wasn't on its face?
Because they have to use this as a feature.
What's that word?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good? Penumbra. Oh, so anyone take astronomy and did anyone take astronomy in college? Anyone remember what a penumbra is?
It's a shadow.
Shadow. So you'll be very happy to know that in the 3rd edition of your casebook, right, there's a new graphic. I actually had this commissioned. An illustrator drew it. So this is a picture that will appear in the 3rd edition of your casebook. I think it's the only casebook in the entire world with astronomy diagrams, but for you, my students, my beloved, anything. So, okay, so did I tell you I went to see the eclipse in Nebraska? Did I tell you that? I don't even know. So, between classes, I flew to Nebraska to go see the eclipse. It was cloudy. Oh, I was so mad. So I didn't see it. All the way to Beatrice, Nebraska, which is about 90 miles from Omaha. It was cloudy. I pulled up into a Walmart parking lot. I had my chair, my glasses, everything ready to roll. It was cloudy. So I didn't see anything, but I was looking for the umbra. So here, let me give you a brief astronomy lesson, my students. Right. So an emanation, right, is a ray of light coming from the sun. Now, during a lunar eclipse, what happens? The Earth comes between the sun and the moon, right? So the moon looks dark. That's how the eclipse works. Okay. The umbra is the darkest part of the shadow here, right? Where the earth blocks all the light and makes it very dark over here. Okay, that's the umbra. The penumbra is the other part of the shadow, right? Where there's some emanations are still visible. Everyone understand that, right? Of course you do. How couldn't you understand that? So, Jessica, I want to go back to you just for a second because you started it. What do you mean on its face? Just give it a little bit more. You're exactly on the right track.
There is no provision that says someone has rights.
Right. But where do you get it from? What was the most distinctive feature of Justice Douglas's opinion? Yeah, Dan, you want to finish it up? What did Justice Douglas say about the Bill of Rights? What was this entire litany of discussion that he went through to get through the answer?
You want to add them up and then create a new act.
Why did he feel the need to look at various provisions of the Bill of Rights?
He wanted to use the 14th Amendment.
What did he want to use?
He wanted to use the Bill of Rights to restrict scrutiny.
Because of? Why do you want to use the Bill of Rights?
Strict scrutiny.
Because why? Why do you want to use the Bill of Rights on the 14th?
Because the 14th has a rational basis.
No, Andre, why do you want to use the Bill of Rights? What are we talking about today?
The right to privacy.
No. Why do you want to use the Bill of Rights? What about that makes it more comfortable for him?
That First Amendment privacy protects from government intrusion.
No. Jonathan? What am I thinking of? Anyone? What am I asking about?
Is he married?
No. No. Why is he so intent on using the Bill of Rights here? What does that get him? Anyone? But specifically, what can he latch on to with this? No. Not that. What? No. Why is he so intent on using the Bill of Rights here? What are we talking about there? What is my true-false question? Good, so finish it.
Presumption of Constitutionality.
When do you narrow it?
When it's under those three buckets.
And which is the first bucket? On the face of the Bill of Rights. Yes, this was a team effort. Good job, team. Team effort. The reason why he has to twist and turn with these emanations and penumbras, and I can never get it right, is because he wants to fit here saying, look, this is on the face of the Constitution. This is on the face of the Bill of Rights. We're not making crap up here. We're not making up, we're not doing Lochner. We are getting this from the Bill of Rights. Right? This way you can sleep easily at night. Now, look, we didn't make this up. This is not just us making it. Look, there's a Fourth Amendment, there's a Fifth Amendment, there's search and seizure, there's a quartering of troops. It's not mentioned right there, arms. But there are a lot of other amendments, right? The essence of Griswold is trying to fit this right of privacy into the New Deal, right? Justice Douglas was appointed by Roosevelt, right? He was. He understood the New Deal very well. And the purpose of Justice Douglas's opinion in Griswold, which makes me chuckle every time I read it, is to try to fit it in with footnote 4. That is what was going on here. They were trying to fit in this recognition of an unenumerated right to privacy, right to birth control, with footnote 4 of Caroline products. That's what's going on here. Everyone understand that, right? That if this is not on the face of the 14th Amendment, you're doing Lochner, right? You're just making up a right that's not there. You're giving the word liberty this new meaning. That's why it does this emanation of penumbras business, right? It's not on its face, but it's, these rays of light shooting out of the Constitution, right? Everywhere. These sparks of light emanating from the documents. Jackson.
So could he have not applied to that strict scrutiny if he had tried to go with the 14th Amendment?
Well, if he went with the 14th Amendment, though, going back to Lochner, isn't he? If he's saying this is just a due process liberty interest. So if you notice, his opinion is very vague about where this right comes from. It doesn't really say one way or the other. Is it the 14th Amendment? Is it the 9th Amendment? Who knows? Who cares, right? This was the 60s. It didn't really matter. But he was trying to avoid saying this is a liberty substantive due process case. Right? Even, again, he characterizes Meyer v. Nebraska and Pierce v. Society of Sisters as First Amendment cases. They weren't. They were due process cases. So it's this convoluted, twisting contortion to get to protection of privacy without going down substantive due process. Now, by the time they get to Roe, it won't even matter. They don't even care anymore. But this was like the first step towards that, right? This was just getting them into the idea of privacy. All right, so it took an hour to explain the introductory question. Very good. Does everyone see why, though? So, going back to our first question, most of you probably guessed. Oh, damn, that's close. Wow. It couldn't be any closer. So, if you ask Justice Douglas, was this consistent with footnote 4? I think he'd tell you yes, it was. That he, in good faith, said this is from the Bill of Rights, on its face, we can squeeze it in. I don't agree with that, but I think that if you had Justice Douglas, he would say it is. But this is a very close vote. Okay, so let's do the facts of the case. I'm jumping all the way around. I'm sorry?
So what's the answer?
Depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
I think it's false.
Okay.
I think it's false. But depends who you ask. I often, my property students give me a hard time. I make these prompt questions, not because I think there's a right or wrong answer, but to stimulate discussion. There's not a right answer usually. I think it's probably false. Okay. All right, so you want to give me the facts, Andre? In Griswold, please? Thank you.
So Griswold was the executive director of Planned Parenthood. Dr. Lee was a doctor who was also a professor at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were...
Dangerous place, Yale. Very dangerous place. You're all much safer in Texas.
Well, while they were, I guess this was a test case.
It was absolutely a test case. Thank you. Very, very astute. How do you know it's a test case, Andre?
Well, I thought I read it. Yeah, it was a test case. Oh, it says it at the top of the page.
Oh, yeah. Duh. Yeah, that's right. It's a test case. Go on. All right, continue, please.
So they were giving like help to married couples for birth control.
Very
and
good.
This was against the Connecticut statute that said anybody who uses anything for birth control will be fined. So they got fined.
Did the law apply to anyone? Connecticut law?
Oh, it says any person who uses any drug for the purpose of conception shall be fined.
Did it apply to married people, unmarried people?
It doesn't say married people here.
Ah. But the couples who they're consulting were married, weren't they?
Yes. They were married. They
What?
were traditionally married.
Why do you think they wanted this case to get married couples and not swing hippies at Yale?
Because
Because Jesus. Oh, that's not the right answer.
Because it's safe. It's safe. It's a safe. They're safe plaintiffs. They're safe victims. Like everybody can, like in the 60s, it was like they were traditionally married. Like it wasn't like a young unmarried black girl.
Quit while you're ahead. I should stop you, Jesus. Quit while you're ahead. Okay, so let me walk you through the facts here. This case was a test case. You're at least right about that part, okay? This is a photograph. This is a photograph of them getting arrested. They wanted to get arrested, right? The law on the books in Connecticut was simply not being enforced, right? No one was enforcing this law. If you wanted to get contraceptives, you could get it. But they wanted a case to go up, probably to the Supreme Court, that would establish a constitutional right to access contraception. That's what this case is about, right? Okay. The reason why they chose married couples, and I'm going to ignore what you said before, is because the concerns are different. So why does a state have an interest in contraception? You probably never thought about this for a minute. To disincentivize promiscuity. What? Yes. If a person is on birth control, the inhibitions for sex are less, right? Because one of the costs of having sex is you can get pregnant, right? That's a facet of human nature. So one of the reasons why the government may have wanted to have this law in the books is to ensure people were not being promiscuous. Okay? But with a married couple, the rationale is different. Presumably with a married couple, they're only having relations with each other, and they're not sleeping around. So in that case, the rationale for contraception is to Planned Parenthood, right? To space out children if you need, or maybe not have them at all. Also with married couples, the risk of venereal disease, which you may call an STI today, but technical VD, was less because they weren't sleeping around, right? Because even if you have a contraceptive, it's not guaranteed to prevent the spread of venereal disease. So the state had certain interests in contraception that were much more, that were weaker with married couples, right? Their interest in contraception with general unmarried people perhaps was a greater interest. And if you notice at the end, the court said, we have no problem with laws with fornication, right? Everyone notice that bit? What is fornication? Basically sleeping around, right? Believe it or not, fornication was a crime. It was a crime to have a relation outside of marriage. Now, it was never enforced, right? But it was at least a crime that could be enforced against people. So this case also didn't involve married couples. It involved Dr. Buxton and Estelle Griswold, who was the director of the clinic. And they were arrested. They were fined, was it $100, for violating the statute. And again, Miss Griswold was not the one taking the birth control herself, right? She was counseling others to take it. And this violated the statute. Okay. A brief note, can a doctor assert a constitutional right on behalf of his patient? That answer is not necessarily yes. The court here said they could, but generally people have to assert their own rights. So what probably could have happened was, imagine a person was using these products and they were arrested. But then again, are you really going to send a cop into a person's bedroom and arrest them as they're putting a condom on? Probably not. So this was, they decided, a least dangerous way of testing this provision. Okay. The beginning of Justice Douglas's majority opinion says, we're not doing Lochner. We promise, we use pinky swear, right? We're not doing Lochner. We decline, as we did in West Coast Hotel v. Parish. We will not sit as a super legislature to determine the wisdom of economic problems. Here comes the but, right? There's always going to be the but. This law, however, operates directly on an intimate relation of husband and wife, right? Husband and wife, and their physician in one aspect of the relation. So what is the difference between regulating how many hours a baker can work and regulating this contraception? You say, well, it's intimate. Well, what does that mean to be intimate? It's in their bedroom. So what they're developing here is this norm that certain private spheres are outside the scope of the normal police power. Right? That's what they're developing here. Okay? And they discuss freedom of speech, they discuss freedom of association. And then we get to the penumbras, right? My favorite line. I can never remember it just right. I'll try to read it from my notes. Okay. The foregoing cases suggest that specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras. Those are the shadows up there. Formed by emanations. That's the sun rays. That help give them life and substance. And again, what they're doing here is saying, look, we're not making crap up. We're not doing Lochner. We are getting this from the Bill of Rights. Okay. So what's the argument? There's associational rights in the First Amendment. The Third Amendment, the right of quartering of troops, protect privacy. The Fourth Amendment protects the right to be free from searches and seizures. The right against self-incrimination protects a zone where the government can't force you to surrender certain things. The Ninth Amendment, right? This passed for constitutional law in the 1960s. If you give this in your exam, you'll get a very bad grade. But what they're trying to do is saying, look, we have all these cases that show this right of privacy exists. This case concerns a relationship in a zone of privacy. And as a result, this is a right that we're deeming fundamental. Once they use those magic words, the F word, right, fundamental, you get it into footnote 4. And once you squeeze it to footnote 4, you get strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny allows the court to probe this and say that this is not within the police power of the state. That's why Douglas has this long ordeal. Okay? That's all there is to the majority opinion. That's it, right? How do we fit this privacy right into the footnote 4 framework? I mean, that's what Douglas is trying to do. It's a very, you know, like, this is a weird opinion when you're reading it. Did it not look like normal opinions you read? It's very different. It doesn't. It's easy to read. It's not hard. There's no, you know, fancy jargon, but it's not your usual opinion. Yes, Kevin.
Is this one zone of privacy? Is it like just one? Because it say zones of privacy.
Well, the other aspect is everyone knew what this case was about, right? This case wasn't about married couples getting birth control. This case was about laying a framework for abortion, right? This decision was basically gearing up for Roe. I mean, they didn't know what it would be called, but they knew an abortion case would be coming down the pike. So your comment, zones. With birth control, it's used in private, you know, 2 people in the bedroom, right? Abortion is not a private procedure. It's done in a medical facility with doctors and anesthesiologists and nurses and other things, right? So when you think of privacy, it's not just the privacy of the bedroom, which is what's going on here. It's a zone of privacy more generally, a certain conduct that the court's saying is outside the control, right? Because think about it. You can make a credible case, husband and wife using condoms, that's private, no one's going to be there. But an abortion specifically has to be a public act, not public when you're on the street, but you're other people around you, it's not just an intimate relation. But here at least they say this is about marriage, and this is my favorite part. We deal with the right of privacy upholding the Bill of Rights. Marriage is a coming together for better or worse, hopefully enduring, and intimate to the degree of being sacred. Justice Douglas is married several times. He married several of his secretaries, got divorced when they got older. He actually considered running for president, but couldn't because of his divorces. It's just too much of a scandal back then. So there's this dreck about promoting a way. It makes me cringe whenever I read it. Right? I'm sorry?
Today he'd be shooing.
He'd be shooing, okay. Or at least you get an Access Hollywood for an appearance. Well, yeah, one at a time. Okay, so that's the majority. I don't have much more to say about the majority. I think the concurring opinions have a lot more to discuss. Jonathan, I think you're next. So let's write Justice Goldberg, right? What's Justice Goldberg saying?
He was just trying to emphasize that the power does something in the Ninth Amendment.
Okay, so we haven't really talked much about the Ninth Amendment. My co-author, Randy Bernard, is one of the world's experts in the Ninth Amendment. I'm not, but I'll do the best I can. The Ninth Amendment provides the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Okay, Jonathan? So we know from our studies who is bound, or which branch of government is bound by the Ninth Amendment?
Federal government.
That's exactly right. The federal government is bound by the Ninth Amendment. Jonathan, is the state of Connecticut bound by the Ninth Amendment? Has the court ever decided to extend the Ninth Amendment to the states? You're right, they haven't. So why is the Ninth Amendment even relevant here? Is it even relevant? Okay. So here's the number one reason why students misread Goldberg's opinion. I did when I was in law school, so I'm guilty just like many of you are. He's not saying that contraception is a right protected by the Ninth Amendment. He does not say that. Right? Because to say that would mean that you have to basically incorporate the Ninth Amendment, which he doesn't do here. He's only concurring opinion. Instead, what he says is that the Ninth Amendment should give us a rule of construction of how to understand liberty more generally, right? What does it say? That the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. In other words, just because our Constitution doesn't mention a right of privacy doesn't mean it's absent, right? Just because our Constitution does not mention privacy does not mean we lack that right. That maybe there are certain rights that are not written down that are beyond the Bill of Rights. Emily, I think you know my next question.
I don't know, but wouldn't the framers think privacy is timeless? Why wouldn't they?
Write it down?
Yeah.
Well, that's Goldberg's point. right? The framers didn't have to write everything down because they gave us the Ninth Amendment saying, look, just because you're going to write stuff down doesn't mean you're so limited. But Elizabeth, my next question is this. How does that statement fit in with footnote 4? How does the Ninth Amendment fit in with footnote 4?
Well, if it was secured by the, if this right was secured by the Ninth Amendment, then it would fit in with the Ninth Amendment.
But what's he saying? Is the right act protected by the Ninth Amendment? Is that what he's saying? So what does footnote 4 say about unenumerated rights? Bingo. Thank you, very good. That's right. So let's go back to our footnote 4, first paragraph. If it's on the face of a prohibition, right? On the face of a prohibition of the Constitution. What Goldberg's saying here is, yeah, I don't care about footnote 4 anymore, right? We can give strict scrutiny to unenumerated rights. Footnote 4 says if the right is unenumerated, that is, the judge is making it up, finding it in nature, who knows, right? In such cases, you give it rational basis review. But what Goldberg's saying is, no. Just because the framers didn't mention the right to privacy in the 14th Amendment doesn't mean it's absent. This is just saying, we will recognize unenumerated rights. We'll recognize them. We'll give them strict scrutiny. But that's in tension with footnote 4. This is why the majority opinion by Douglas can't really go down the Ninth Amendment route. He mentions it, right? But to accept the Ninth Amendment is to reject footnote 4. Which you have to ask yourselves, how can you have a test in constitutional law that violates the Ninth Amendment, right? If the Ninth Amendment says we will protect unenumerated rights, and footnote 4 says no, we won't, then footnote 4 has to be wrong. That's what my colleague Randy argues. Okay? So that's the Goldberg opinion. And he's more or less just saying, look, we're not going to be here to try to twist footnote 4. Let's just be honest. Let's be honest here, guys, and admit what we're doing. That judges can recognize these unenumerated. Okay. So any other questions on Goldberg? Yes, Jackson.
So is this saying that everything needs to have strict scrutiny if it's remotely related to a constitutional issue?
Does he give much guidance on what is and is not protected? No, he doesn't. What they're trying to do here is try different things to lay the groundwork for abortion. They're trying to put things in motion, right? They're saying, look, our Constitution is outmoded, we need to update it. But there's not much of a, I might say guardrails, right? There's not many guardrails in this opinion. So other questions on Goldberg? Yeah, I read it the same way a lot of you did probably when I was in law school. That's Goldberg. Let's do Harlan.
It's pretty much saying that it should be based only on the 14th Amendment and the other things in the 14th Amendment instead of
And then, so how are judges under the Harlan approach supposed to know the rights protected by the 14th Amendment? It just says liberty, right? That's all it says. What's his test?
Whether it violates implicit.
Oh yeah, you got it. Keep going.
Concept of ordered liberty.
Yeah. So Harlan has this test that he repeats, and he says we have to check whether the law violates, quote, basic values implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. What? Implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. What the heck is he talking about? Let's go. What's ordered liberty mean?
Is it kind of look into the past cases and just see what they thought?
Yeah. Anyone else take a stab? I still don't know what this means after all these years. I have no idea. Anyone take a stab? Implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. I mean, I know what it means, but it's difficult. Implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. Don't rely on these silly emanations. Just go to the 14th Amendment. Right? Anthony, how is a judge looking at the word liberty in the 14th Amendment supposed to know what it means? Right? I mean, this is the problem, Lochner, right? This is why we have footnote 4. My meaning of liberty is different than your meaning of liberty. That's a problem for judges. What is Harlan saying here? How can this be done?
look back at what they said in the past.
What judges have done before, that's a scope of enforceability. Case, you want to take a stab?
I kind of thought it was what they've done before.
So like tradition, is that what you're saying? Custom, practice?
Just their interpretation of
Your struggling is not surprising. I've been teaching this for some time. I don't know what it means. I have no idea. But what Harlan's getting at is that judges can understand restrictions in the 14th Amendment by looking at history, practice, tradition. What are these customs rooted in our culture? Does that get you to a right to privacy? Does that get you to a right of birth control? Harlan doesn't really explain one way or the other why it's the case. But this dissent from Harlan will come up over and over again. But I think at least Harlan has the virtue of saying, look, let's just be honest here, right? We're making this about the 14th Amendment and substantive due process. Let's cut the crap, right? We don't need the 9th Amendment. We don't need the emanations of numbers. Let's just admit that this is Lochner's and be done with it. Okay? And Justice White says that even more clearly. This is different from Lochner. These aren't mere economic rights. Economic liberty is different from these sort of liberty interests. Okay? Let's move on to Justice Black. Carlo, what's Justice Black's dissent?
Talking more about the 14th Amendment guarantees against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Does Justice Black think that courts should be finding these unenumerated rights here?
Does he think what?
Does Justice Black think that courts should be identifying these unenumerated rights?
No.
Okay, why not? Kevin?
Because you cannot find them anywhere in the Bill of Rights.
Can't find them, no. Why can't he find them? They're not there, yeah. It was a trick question, but you got it, right? What Black is saying here is, I am not, as a judge, going to enforce rights that are not clearly written down. I'm going to stick to footnote 4 here, first bucket, right? Unless it's something on the face of the amendment, I'm not game. Because at this point, judges have no guidelines to decide what the meaning of liberty is. Right? This is basically Lochnerism, and it gives judges unlimited power. Okay? He makes a couple points I think are actually kind of funny. He's like, well, how are we supposed to know what the traditions and the collective conscience of the people are? Do we commission a poll, right, a Gallup poll? Do we survey people what the Constitution means? Is that what our law is? It's often said that Justice Black was one of the originalists, so to speak, that he was one of the first justices to give meaning to the text of the Constitution. It's not true at all. There were people going all the way back to John Marshall doing this, but in the modern era, Black gets a lot of credit for that. Okay? He writes that courts can't sit as a supervisory agent over acts of legislative bodies because the court thinks these policies are unwise. Okay? All right, he goes on about Lochner. Okay? What, David, does Justice Stewart say, Potter Stewart? There's a very famous line which I always chuckle at.
Well, he talks about that the court tries to refer to like 6 amendments to the Constitution, and he doesn't think that Connecticut law infringes any of the amendments.
No.
And that he thinks that it's like basically you're trying to, like, the court's like really overreaching, I guess, to find that Connecticut law is unconstitutional.
Yeah, good. What does Justice Stewart David think of the law as a matter of policy? Has he characterized this law? It's a very famous expression.
Well, I mean, I guess as a matter of social policy, I think professional counsel about methods of birth control should be available to all.
Yeah. Does he think this is a smart law? Wise law?
He thinks it's an uncommonly
Yeah,
silly
that's what I'm
law.
looking for. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very famous line. The law is uncommonly silly. So what he's basically saying here is, look, this law is stupid, right? In no sense will the government go to people's bedrooms and yank their condoms away and arrest them, right? It's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But the fact that the law is uncommonly silly does not make it unconstitutional. You'll see this line again in a dissent by Justice Thomas in the Lawrence v. Texas case. This involves the Texas sodomy statute. And Thomas writes that it's an uncommonly silly law. And if Thomas were a member of the Texas legislature, he would vote to repeal it. But that's not the same thing as saying it's unlawful. Okay? All right, so the Griswold case, and it's hard for me to summarize it because everyone's all over the place. The majority clings to the notion that we can fit this in footnote 4, that this isn't a Bill of Rights, the emanation of the numbers. Right? Justice Goldberg's like, forget emanation of the numbers, let's just go to the Ninth Amendment and say we'll start recognizing other rights. And you have Justice Harlan saying, well, we don't need the Ninth Amendment, just use the 14th Amendment by itself. And then you have the dissenters, right? You have Stewart and Black, who are saying, stick to the text, stupid, it's not in there, stop making it up. Right? 7-2 decision by the court. But you have to understand Griswold as like a layover, right? It's a stopover until a row that would come several years later. So any other questions on Griswold, Connecticut? Questions on Griswold? Yes, Brandon.
For Harlan's concurring opinion, is ordered liberty, according to him, these things on page 1053, the teachings of history, solid recognition of the basic values, and wise appreciation of the great roles that the doctrines of federalism. Is that what he's referring to?
I don't know the book in front of me. What are you reading from? I'm sorry.
I'm trying to, I can't remember what you said about what he thinks ordered liberty.
Yeah, okay, so it's a good question, Brendan. He doesn't really specify what that means. Okay. He gets his phrase ordered liberty from another case, if you want to look it up, called Palco v. Connecticut, Palko v. Connecticut from the 1920s. I haven't read that case in a very long time, so I can't tell you what they were talking about. But the general gist is certain rights are very important, very fundamental when they're deeply rooted in history. That is, if there's a certain right that's been protected for a very long time, that's a suggestion that maybe the Constitution ought to protect it. So I'll give you an example, Brandon, right? Remember Meyer v. Nebraska? That was a case involving the state banned the teaching of foreign languages in schools. Remember this case? And Justice McReynolds had this paragraph where he said, these are the fundamental rights: the right to raise children, the right to instruct them, the right to pursue an honest calling, the right to marriage. Like, he listed like 8 or 9 different things. It'll be in your notes. That is generally probably what Harlan was referring to. And he said, look, you have this right of marriage, this right of close relations. Of course, it embraces the right that when you're in your bedroom, you can't be told what kind of contraceptive to use. I think that's what he's getting at, but he doesn't, Portia's word doesn't really nail it specifically, but he comes close. Yeah, well.
Could it mean what Justice Black said in his dissent, was that good men have said that when he talks about music, rhapsodical strains about the duty of this court to keep the Constitution in tune with the times.
Yeah.
And then he said that he with great deference rejects that opinion and feels that if changes want to be made, then it should be done through
modernity, right? So if the Constitution should be modernized, I think is what you're getting at, it's done through amendment and not through judicial updating. Right? What I think the majority strives very hard though not to take that position. They say, look, this is going back to 1787. This is not us making it up. But you'll see when you get to the case involving sodomy and even same-sex marriage, there is this desire to say that what we're doing here is not new, we're just reinforcing old traditions. That becomes a very difficult argument to strain when we're talking about same-sex marriage. Like, they make it, but it becomes much more strained. So questions about number, Griswold, I'm sorry. Anyone else in Griswold? All right. The next case, Roe, is a case that, frankly, doesn't need much of a introduction. Everyone knows it. People know the name. But who is Roe and who is Wade, right? Who are these people? You often hear Jane Doe, right? DOE, like when you make up a name in a case. This is Jane Roe, ROE. That's where the name of the case come from. Her actual name, Jane Roe, was Norma McCorvey. I have a picture of her somewhere on here. This is her, Norma McCorvey. She actually lived in Sugar Land, or somewhere nearby. She died in the last year. She did not have a happy life. I'll give you a brief sketch of her life. But McCorvey had been living, I think, in Dallas. Of course, it's a Texas case, right? She'd been living in Dallas, and she had had a couple kids before, and she got pregnant again and decided she didn't want to carry the child to term. At the time, such an abortion would have been illegal in Texas. The pregnancy didn't risk her life in any respect. So she was asking around friends to find where she could obtain an abortion, even if it was outside of the state. What happens next is subject to dispute, but I'll give you at least her account of it. She came across two people who were working on litigation, and they wanted to bring a constitutional challenge to Texas's abortion law. In order to do that, they needed a pregnant woman, right? They needed someone who wanted to get an abortion and could not obtain one. According to McCorvey, she was duped. She told these people, look, I just want to get an abortion, I don't want to bring this litigation, whatever. She says they lied to her, and they made her fill out a police complaint, an affidavit, saying that she'd been raped, which she later said was not true. And they filed a lawsuit with McCorvey as the lead plaintiff. Because they needed this lawsuit to succeed, she couldn't get an abortion. Because once she terminated the pregnancy, the case would more or less finish. So they had to keep her pregnant, and this is what she later regretted, saying that she didn't want to carry the child to term. She ultimately carried it to term and gave up for adoption. But the circumstances of this case are very unsavory. In any event, she eventually did give birth, right? Pregnancy lasts 9 months. The trip to the Supreme Court took about 3 years. So I'll mention this briefly. How is it possible that a case that takes 3 years, the child was delivered, was not dismissed as moot? The court has a doctrine called capable of repetition yet evading review. Capable of repetition yet evading review. What that means is if there's a problem that pops up over and over again, right, it's capable of repetition, but it's going to evade review every time because pregnancy lasts 9 months. The court will basically keep it anyway. So it wasn't even necessary for her to keep the child. She could have probably had the abortion, the case would have stayed, but the people she was working with didn't want her, the poster child of the case, be getting a legal abortion. The case, she was a very unhappy person, and I think she was taken advantage of by these attorneys. I think she was. But it gets worse for her. Later on in life, she became a born-again Christian. And she became very much pro-life. And she said things like, this was the biggest mistake of my life to be the plaintiff in this case. She regretted it. And she testified before Congress, but it doesn't get happy for her there because the pro-life community used her also. And used her as like a PR spokesperson, as like a marketing slogan. So read her obituary in the New York Times. I think it captures it well. She was abused by both sides of the issue. I think she had a very... she didn't want any of this, right? This was not what she wanted in her life, but she became so closely identified with it, both by the pro-choice community at first, and then later on by the pro-life community. I think they both used her. So very, very, very sad. I think she died in the last 6 or 8 months, somewhere in Sugar Land or something. But those are the facts. The facts almost don't even matter because the case is such an important gravity. So. Who's next? Where am I up to? All right, Evan. You want to walk us through walk us through the case.
Well, it starts off, in my opinion, kind of weird because they don't really.
Weird? What do you mean weird?
Because they're not really citing laws. It's more like they're citing, I guess, it's science, and they're really making sure they acknowledge both sides' views on the topic, more so than any law. They do briefly touch on the law. They cite the Griswold about the 14th Amendment, the 9th Amendment, and the Bill of Rights. But they don't really talk about, they go through the history, abortions in the country. After that they explain, I guess they go through a couple of reasons why some abortion laws have stayed or become more stringent over the years. And then they eventually get to acknowledging that there is, which is when I also say it's weird, is they're using the argument of right of privacy in this case, even though it didn't really, I think as you mentioned before, it doesn't really apply because it's not a private act, abortion. It's not public, but it's between more than two people. They cite a bunch of different amendments, First Amendment, Fourth, Fifth, 9th, 14th Amendment. I think what they ultimately, this is why I also say it's weird, once again they go back to, they don't cite law, they focus on their opinion on what should be the law on science.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for that. I a lot of points we'll get back to. But I want to echo Evan's sense of this kind of a weird opinion, because it doesn't read like your usual opinions. It's a very different tone. And it begins, I want to read this passage to you, right at the beginning. It says, "We forthwith acknowledge our awareness of the sensitive and emotional nature of the abortion controversy, of the vigorous opposing views, even among physicians, and the deep and seemingly absolute convictions that the subject inspires. One's philosophy, one's experiences, one's exposure to the raw edges of human existence, one's religious training, one's attitude towards life and family and their values, and the moral standards one establishes and seeks to observe are all likely to influence and color one's thinking and conclusions about abortion." Adam, what's going on there? What are they saying there? What's the? I just raised that long passage, right?
It's a complicated issue that has a lot of different facets that people can't, they can't pull out their individual emotions and religious beliefs and what they were raised with from, science and, contradictory views. They can't pull apart.
But Adam, if this is true that this is such an emotional issue, why isn't one best dealt with by the legislature, right? How can courts but they acknowledge candidly this is a very tough issue, tugs this right? Why is it something that the court's going to decide? What's the setup of the court's opinion then?
Well, they kind of go through it's going to change a lot every time there's an election. At least in my view, that's sort of this is such a hot topic that the legislature can have very different, opinions from state to state or region to region, and those can be contradictory to each other.
Yeah, Brandon, let me ask you the same question. If this is such an emotional issue, which it is, even 40 years later, right? Abortion still every year. Why does the court say they can still decide this in light of this emotional tug, left, right?
Well, they say it's an issue of privacy.
Good. Keep going. You're on the right track.
They determine that they can decide, through their analysis of history, that they make the judgment that that a fetus is not a person. And so that's their footing for feeling like they can make a decision about this issue under the or in the penumbra.
Brandon, on what basis do they think they can decide this case? On the basis of emotion? On the basis of philosophy? On the basis of religion? What basis can they decide this case?
guess I would say law.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm looking for, right? The Constitution. And this is the key quote, right? They say, we can decide this free of emotion based on the Constitution. That's what the court says. We can decide this free of emotion based on the Constitution. And they cite Holmes in Lochner. They cite Holmes. Can you imagine? A decision finding a right to abortion, they rely on Holmes. Holmes would be spinning in his grave. His mustache would be curling onto itself, right? Kevin.
The part that you just read to us, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Dred Scott.
Oh, so glad you mentioned that. Why?
Because of just the struggle the Tawny Fort was having with slavery during that time.
Yeah. Yeah. So you'll read a case for next class, maybe you read Scalia, dissent in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And he directly compares Roe to Dred Scott. And he suggests that the same sort of social issues that divide the nation on slavery, are similar to the social issues that divide the country in abortion. Dred Scott only tried to resolve this big issue, didn't work. Roe tried to resolve this big issue, didn't work. Right? So I'm glad you made a comparison. You'll see there's a funny picture there for that reason. You jumped my point. But what they're saying is, we are doing what Holmes did in Lochner, that this is an answer in the Constitution. And I think Evan noted there's not much constitutional citations there. You cite against Griswold and a few other cases. One other sentence, which I skipped over, I want to go back to. He says, in addition, population growth, pollution, poverty, and racial overtones tend to complicate and not to simplify the issue. Amber, what's he getting at there?
I think he's talking about the fact that the future is unknown and eventually we could have population issues. In
Yeah.
which case, the state would be
Yeah, exactly. This is the most morbid sentence in the entire opinion, if that's even conceivable. Population growth, pollution, poverty, and racial overtones tend to complicate, not simplify the problem. What he's basically saying is, there are limits to our growth. This was a famous book, The Limits of Growth. And we'll run out of food, and we'll run out of water. And we may need abortion to constrict the population to prevent overpopulation. This was a legitimate fear in the 1970s. This was a credible fear. Thomas Malthus was a famous philosopher who believed that we'll run out of food one day. And we have Malthusians in every generation. They're always wrong. We find ways of making more food. We have no problem making food. But his point here is we're going to need abortion, perhaps, to deal with population growth, with too much pollution, right? Poverty, and racial overtones. So, Andre, you mentioned a point before that Jerry responded to. He's making that point explicitly, that the issue of abortion had a huge racial component. And he's putting it in the Supreme Court opinion, that might be the reason why to keep it. So this sentence, which I always blanch at when I read, is very significant, because he's saying these are the issues troubling us in the year 1972, 73, right? That's just the first paragraph. The actual legal analysis can be done fairly quickly. The lower court based its decision on the 9th Amendment, on the 14th Amendment, basically everything. They threw everything at the table. The court doesn't really discuss the grounding of this. It comes from the 14th Amendment. Where exactly, not very important. But they do walk through the various reasons why the state would want to have an abortion law. So one reason, which I mentioned before, is to discourage illicit sexual conduct. Right? Remember I said this before? You want to discourage promiscuity, fornication. Texas doesn't rely on this interest, probably for good reasons, because probably they're all guilty of it. But the rationale relied on by the state concerns safety for the mother and also safety for the life of the fetus, unborn child, right? How does the court, David, address this second interest, this interest in the safety of the mother? How does the court walk through this?
I think they cite some statistics and science about when the life of the mother is of an abortion, like the risks of death for the mother are the same here as they would be later.
So the court's analysis here is very much based on science, or at least science in the 1970s. Every year, the prenatal care changes and becomes better and better. And I don't pretend to know at what point a child can live outside the womb. I don't know. I don't know the answers, right? But every year, science gets better. So at least in the 1970s, they had the general sense that abortions earlier in pregnancy are safer than abortions later. As time progresses, the possibility of a risk from an abortion goes up. So the court derives a simple principle, right? The state has a greater interest in regulating abortions later on, where the risk to the mother is more severe. But where an abortion is performed earlier on in the pregnancy, the risk is lower, the state's interest is less. And this gives rise to this framework, right? This framework based on trimesters. Okay? And under this trimester framework, which is, pregnancy is 9 months, more or less, right? Might be more, might be a little bit less, but it's about 9 months. During this first trimester, the court says that the state's interest in protecting the health of the mother is fairly narrow, right? They can regulate the doctors, they can regulate sanitary conditions, they can regulate surgical standards, right? But they can't prohibit outright the performance of an abortion during this first trimester. So that's the first half of it, right? That's the mother's health. Now, Aaron, what about prenatal life, right? What's the state's interest in prenatal life during this very first 3-month period, the first trimester?
The first trimester?
Yes, sir. Does the government have any interest in prenatal life during the first trimester, according to the court?
Does the government have interest in it?
Yeah. Can the government regulate to protect prenatal life during the first trimester, according to the court?
No, they decide to leave that up to the doctor.
Yeah. During the first trimester, the court says, the state has no meaningful interest in protecting prenatal life. Why? Because at the first 3 months, the child can't live outside the womb. They don't answer the tough question when life begins. They say, at this point, it's too early. And the state has no interest during the first trimester in prenatal life. 0. So the only compelling interest there is actually the woman's right to, with her doctor, as you said, consult for an abortion. Okay? Boone, is this right of this right to privacy or this right to privacy absolute during this first trimester?
No, not totally.
Why not? What restrictions can be imposed during the first trimester?
They still have to use like a license issue.
Right, and that's an important point, right? You can have certain restrictions in the first trimester about licensing, make sure your doctor has surgical standards, sanitary, stuff like that, but they can't prohibit it outright. In other words, the regulations in the first trimester must be designed to help the mother's health. They can't be designed to protect prenatal life, right? Again, during the first trimester, whatever laws exist can protect health, safe conditions, right? Doctor, clean, whatever. They can't they can't promote prenatal life. And one argument I'll mention briefly, is a fetus protected by the 14th Amendment? And here the court's very textualist, right? At least in this spot. The 14th Amendment says all persons born, blah, 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 blah. So it specifically says persons have to be born. That's what the 14th Amendment says. States could have a different definition perhaps, but the 14th Amendment doesn't go that far. Okay? So that's the first trimester, right? Let me write this out so you guys can keep track. Okay? So the first trimester, right? No interest in prenatal life, but there is a limited interest in the mother's health. Okay? First trimester. Okay. Jackson, what's the deal with the second trimester?
the state has more of an interest, I guess, in this because it's more dangerous to perform the procedure after the first trimester.
Okay. Jackson, does the government have an interest in prenatal life during the second trimester?
They have more of an interest.
Well, in the first one they have zero interest. So they have some interest?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So they say has some interest in prenatal life. And what about their interest in the mother's health?
Also.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a greater interest in the mother's health, right? Why? Because as time progresses, the performing of an abortion can be more risky. Okay? And then, you want to finish up, Alyssa? What's the deal in the third trimester?
In the third trimester, they let the states regulate whether they can have abortions in the state or not.
They may be prohibited, can't they? So in the third trimester, there's a compelling interest in prenatal life. And they have a very strong interest, right? So they have a compelling interest in the mother's health. In this third trimester, the abortion can be banned, period. So from months 6 through 9, the state can ban it outright. And if you don't like my hasty summary up here, if you go to the end of the court's opinion, they say to summarize and to repeat. I call this the press release part of the opinion. Have you ever seen an opinion that summarizes holding like that? You've been in my class now, what, 5, 6, 7 weeks, right? You won't see it. You won't see that again. But they were writing this from newspapers, right? They basically put it in there in basic bullet points to describe when you could and could not get this restriction. Okay. That's it. That's the majority. It doesn't have much in the terms of why this is the correct framework. We do know that Justice Blackmun, the majority, was an attorney for the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota for a number of years. And he apparently spent an entire summer researching this question and did all this historical research about when were abortions allowed at different points. And there was this thing called quickening. You know what quickening is? Quickening was the idea of when the child starts stirring in the womb. And he said historically you never had abortions before quickening. So he tried to figure out where it was. In any event, this trimester framework is fairly rigid. Okay? So any questions on the Roe majority? It's very easy to describe. I mean, the reason why I break it down like this is when we do Casey next week, the court modifies it. So we'll do the modifications next week. Okay. All right. So Alyssa, I'm sorry, Kelsey. I'm sorry. You just wow, Kelsey. Give me, please, what's Justice Stewart's opinion? Stewart in the book? Yeah,
First he talks about the Griswold case, and then he goes into like strict or careful scrutiny and the 14th Amendment.
What, Kelsey? What does Justice Stewart say about Lochner and basically just this idea of substantive due process? Is he running away from it anymore?
No, he says that the liberty is protected, and that the laws.
Is there any discussion of footnote 4 here anymore?
No.
No. Is there any discussion of footnote 4 anywhere in the opinion? So at this point they buried footnote 4, right? At least the first paragraph. Right? At least in Griswold, Justice Douglas tried to do the emanations of the numbers dance to hook the opinion into the first 10 amendments. Here there's no aspect, right? There's very little discussion about the 10 amendments. This is all about the 14th Amendment. This is all about the due process clause. There's nothing in the 9th Amendment here. So at this point, they've more or less come to terms with, well, we're going to cite Justice Holmes and Lochner, but we're going to do what Justice Peckham did in the majority, and we don't really care. Okay. Cortland, what's Justice Rehnquist's dissent here? What does Justice Rehnquist accuse the majority of here?
I think that they're taking it too far.
Well, yeah, they're definitely taking it too far. Why?
That there's a woman's right to privacy is not encompassed in the Constitution when it comes to
what does he accuse the majority of? What does he accuse the majority of doing?
Oh, that they're trying to, sorry, I don't remember.
Take your time, it's okay.
That they're putting like a weird standard on it.
Where does Rehnquist think the majority is getting this rule from? Is there any historical source they're getting it from?
No,
Where are they getting it from?
just like thin air, basically.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Thin air?
Oh, I like that. Yeah, thin air, right? Basically, Rehnquist saying they're making this up. They're getting this out of nowhere. And he says they are doing what Lochner did, and this is the same exact dynamic, right? This three trimester framework thing. If this was a statute, it might make a lot of sense, but for the court, they don't have much to go on here. Okay, Mark, what's Justice White's dissent? He gives a little bit more.
He found no constitutional warrant for imposing such an order on the legislatures in the states.
What does that mean?
Well, it kind of goes back to a theme throughout the dissents in these cases today, that it should be left with the state legislatures.
Yeah, let me pause you right there, Mark. So this was mentioned in the Griswold case. The statute was simply never being enforced in Connecticut. And I think one branch of the Connecticut government voted to repeal, the other branch hadn't. Mark, once the Supreme Court rules, is there any reason why the government needs to take this vote on to repeal the statute?
No.
Okay. When you have these decisions, it disables the legislature from acting. Maybe the Texas legislature would have considered modifying its abortion law, right? In fact, if you look at the trend before Roe, states were generally liberalizing their abortion laws. This is a hard point to convey because we all came of age in a certain time, but abortion was not the issue it was today back in the 70s. By a lot of accounts, abortion became such a contentious issue because of Roe. And you know, evangelical Christians didn't really focus on abortion much before this case. It just wasn't a big issue. It was after Roe. So in many respects, Roe fought back support for abortion that may have otherwise been there. But by making this a constitutional issue, it retards the democratic process. It makes it harder to repeal laws through the ballot box. And I think that is probably true. Justice White calls this an exercise of raw judicial power. That the court did this, maybe they have the authority, but they shouldn't have done this. It's improvident and extravagant. Effectively, what the dissenters are saying, and there are only two dissents, is that this is a mistake, and that this will make it harder for people to ever come to terms in abortion. This, I think, is Kevin's point also. By setting this fairly strict framework, you're basically removing the issue from the democratic process. Now, I'll wrap up here in a minute, but what you'll see in your reading for class next week is that the Roe framework didn't hold. This strict trimester framework things did not hold very long. And by the time you got to 1991 or 1992, people recognized that this was far too rigid. And what you'll see in the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey is the court shifts from this 3-trimester framework to a line based on viability. And that perhaps the benefit that viability can shift as science improves. And as science gets better at being able to keep a fetus alive outside the womb for some period of time, that perhaps can modify the Constitution. But the sort of framework addressed here did very little to resolve the very problems that Justice Blackmun identified at the outset. So, questions on Roe? All right, I'll summarize a bit. We did a lot today. So, to understand constitutional law in the 20th century, you have to go the full gamut. You have to start with the Lochner era and recognize that the courts were reading the word liberty in the 14th Amendment to protect certain rights that are not written down anywhere. And then you get to the New Deal, and there was this rejection of Lochner, saying, we can't do this. We're judges. We can't substitute our wisdom and make up rights. So we had Caroline Products, footnote 4, said, look, we'll cabin our discretion. We'll limit it to cases where we have laws affecting the Bill of Rights. laws affecting political process, laws affecting discrete and insular minorities. And that held up for maybe 20 or 30 years until you got to the 60s, when they recognized that, wait a minute, if we stick to our New Deal jurisprudence, we don't get to contraception, we don't get to privacy, we don't get to abortion. So the court began to chip away at that New Deal structure in Griswold, and by the time they got to Roe, they just tossed it out to the trash. But footnote 4 still exists for economic liberty claims. And to this day, if you bring a claim based on Lochner-style arguments that this workplace regulation is unconstitutional, you get rational basis. But for certain rights that the court likes, the rights they deem fundamental, those rights get to sort of strict scrutiny. And we'll see even later, even when the court doesn't label a right fundamental, Justice Kennedy doesn't like that label, the court still gives it what amounts to strict scrutiny. Anything else? Going once? Twice? Happy Halloween, everyone. I'll see you on Thursday. Oh, I got you. Thank you.